Greetings. This is literacy consultant Laura Adams with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, here to bring you one of our sessions for DPI's Wisconsin Literacy Unconference 2014. And I am very pleased to introduce Amy McGovern, a reading specialist in the Wausau School District. And she's going to be talking today about DIBELS Next. And so this presentation is specifically about DIBELS Next for grades 1 through 5. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome. Hello, everyone. Okay, today's presentation, we're going to focus on DIBELS Next, and specifically the oral reading fluency, or as we call it in Ames Web, the RCDM. And it's geared towards 1st through 5th grade. Before we begin getting into the content, the purpose really of this will be to dig into the data and then plan for instruction based on what you're seeing from your screener. And I'm going to lean on lessons learned from my school district. We've been using DIBELS since 2010. We just switched over to Ames Web. And prior to that, we were using it as in our Reading First school. So DIBELS Next was one of our contenders. So as a disclaimer, I'll share that we don't use DIBELS Next. We use Ames Web. However, all of these universal screeners, DIBELS, DIBELS Next, Ames Web, they all come from the same family of researchers and the same body of research. So, and their core subtests are virtually the same, with just a little bit of a tweak with that letter sound fluency one. Okay, so why would we use DIBELS Next or any of the universal screeners I've mentioned? And there's a few reasons. The first, of course, is we want to shake out and filter out the students who may be at risk for reading failure. And we certainly want to support you in helping to identify those students who need additional support. To monitor our students for progress monitoring, take our time and be sure that we found the right students who are going to require that weekly progress monitoring. And the nice thing about DIBELS and Ames, and they're all designed to be very sensitive to small changes in growth, so we can actually measure the impact of our instruction on a much more frequent basis than we can with other ways of testing. And then, of course, we're going to examine the effectiveness of our whole school system just by the percentage of students who might be placing at risk or some risk. It gives us an insight into whether or not our core curriculum is working well, and I'll talk more about that briefly shortly. The advantages, of course, it's specifically designed to be used with the problem-solving mode like RTI, and the measures are valid and reliable. And we, of course, got research-based benchmarks, which I know I really appreciate having that big normed sample to compare the students to see how we line up next to that larger normed sample. So there are some appropriate and inappropriate uses, and I think in the age of teacher effectiveness, it's important to highlight appropriate uses for DIBELS. And certainly, as I mentioned, identifying students who may be at risk for reading failure is at the top of the list, and identifying that support, and of course monitoring them. But an inappropriate use would be labeling kids, tracking them, making significant decisions about retention or promotion based on a DIBELS score. That's not an appropriate use of these measures, and it's good to know that. These are not diagnostic tools. They're simply a way of helping us screen out the kids who may be at risk and then to check their progress on these DISTIC measures of literacy. And again, from a system standpoint, if you have large numbers of students placing at risk from risk, it's worth looking at your core to see what's going on, because that is a value of a system like this. So an inappropriate use, we should never evaluate teachers based off of their DIBELS scores. We shouldn't make decisions about funding based off DIBELS scores. And you don't want to reward or punish students based on how they've done on their DIBELS. Okay, these are tests of early literacy, and just like going to the doctor, it's a very similar analogy. I like this analogy. When you go to the doctor, you've got to have your blood pressure checked, your heart rate, and all the typical things that they do when they're looking at a regular checkup. This is a good analogy for using these early literacy screeners as well. We're going to look into phonemic awareness, basic phonics through nonsense word fluency, The word attack in advanced phonics shows up through oral reading fluency. The child's ability to reconnect the text, that is really highlighted in the oral reading fluency. And we know for sure that there is a correlation between how many words students read correctly and how well they comprehend. And it's a very tight correlation in kindergarten and first grade, and even into the first semester of second grade, you can tell a lot. So at the youngest grades, it's almost the most reliable. And finally, the vocabulary and language skills that we can acquire through word use fluency, which is showing back up through DIBELS Next. They've revised that, and it's available on an experimental basis. And I'll mention days as well. It's days in DIBELS and nays in Ames Web. Those are new for those of us who did DIBELS 6th edition. And that closed reading passage is a wonderful way of checking for basic vocabulary and basic comprehension skills in 3 minutes. You get a nice little measure. Scarborough's reading rope is a great visual for demonstrating the importance of language comprehension and word recognition and how they really do wind together to build a fluent reader over time. You cannot have a fluent reader without both of these skills in place. And so DIBELS, Ames Web, all of these measures are giving that in that green circle. We're taking a measure, a dipstick measure into the children's ability to have these word recognition skills in place. And if they don't, what are we going to do about it? DIBELS doesn't tell us that, but at least we get an indicator of whether or not we need to investigate further. A few more notes. Because we end up filtering out those red zone kids, the at-risk kids, and the some risk kids, it's important to point out that what we know about struggling readers, 80% of them struggle with both decoding and comprehension. So this is from Dr. Louisa Moats and research from her team and many others who she's put together a consensus on this information. So 80% of struggling readers struggle with both decoding and comprehension. Only about 12 to 15% struggle with, they have good comprehension and poor decoding. And interesting to note that that's often the definition of a dyslexic, to have poor decoding but have background knowledge and can take in information orally. And if you were to read the story, the student would understand every single thing you said and could retell and summarize and make connections. But give them their own passage and read it on their own, they can't do it. That's about 12 to 15% of the students who qualify as struggling readers. And finally, what I used to hear a lot in my district was, ooh, they're really great decoders, but they're poor comprehenders. The research says that that good decoder, poor comprehender is really only about 5% of our students. So I'm going to, as we work through today's presentation, I'm going to be asking you to think about how you attend to these foundational skills that are on that reading rope and what you're doing to really address those, because if it's nearing the end of the year now and if you still have a lot of students who are in that red and yellow zone, perhaps there's some tweaks to your foundational skill teaching that may need to be made. So I'll share some insights on that as we go. Okay, this chart should be familiar. I know that DIBELS has updated the benchmark cut scores. This was right from their document, still available online, right on the DIBELS Next webpage, showing all the cut scores all the way through fall, winter, and spring. And what we're looking for is that composite, the composite score and the instructional recommendation. So if you're using Ames Web, you're going to look for that report that tells you the instructional recommendation, and it usually uses language like what you see here. The students who are doing just fine are going to be placed at benchmark. They're at the 40th percentile or higher. The average student hovers around the 50th percentile, so any student who is at or above the 50th is probably, statistically speaking, their chances of them passing their state test are high, of being, good, strong readers, very high. Then you have these kids in the yellow range, and their chances of passing those tests are about 50-50. There may or may not be a reading comprehension issue with students who are in this range. They So some more work has to be teased out for these kids to place in the strategic range, and that's where you need to be using your diagnostic assessments. And the same, of course, is true for your most at-risk intensive students. Many of the kids in this range might already be identified special ed, not always though. And the good news, the really good news, is that none of these colors, red, yellow, or green, wherever you land, none of them are a life sentence. That we know with certainty that good instruction can change children's trajectories and really impact their learning. So here's what DIBELS Next talks about with their composite score. They want you to pay closest attention to the number of students who've met the benchmark on the composite. And if you have met the benchmark for the composite score, you have an 80 to 90% likelihood of being just fine in your core literacy instruction. The world's good for you. If you're in that some risk category, there may be some need to provide some strategic support, and how that looks will play out. I'll give you some different scenarios in a minute. And finally, that the children who don't meet the benchmark, who are well below it, those are the real at-risk students, and they're likely to not only need intensive intervention, but they're also likely to need something in their core instruction to look different as well. And I think that's someplace where we haven't necessarily gone. We send kids out and we don't necessarily know what they're doing when they leave, or maybe we do. So room for conversation. So here is a sample student with an oral reading fluency probe. And the child read 73 words in all. They skipped a row, which proficient readers, we know from the research from Dick Allington and Alan Keene, proficient readers do not skip rows. They just don't. I mean, generally what we know about them is they're very accurate in their reading, 97 to 98% accurate. So this student has made 2 errors, skipped a whole row, and 1 self-correction, and everything counts as a mistake here except for that self-correct, which means they made 15 errors altogether, which means their accuracy is at 79%. So the question is, how accurate do we need students to be? Okay, well, we might plot that student's information on progress monitoring forms, and you can do this either online or on the paper pencil booklet. This is just an example graph. And here's a decision tree, which we're going to come to as we're thinking about what to do about students. I'm going to share with you something that our district learned from Lexi Domorowski, who is a DIBELS expert out from Oregon, and she shared a quadrant analysis which gets at this image that you're seeing here. And I have the resource cited for this later in the presentation. So it's important to look at kids. Are they established in their benchmark? What do we do if they are? If they're not, what do we do and how do we approach this? So let's keep going. I'm going to come back to that slide. So the target is 97%. That is our target for accuracy. You'll see different things on that chart from DIBELS. Sometimes like they gave you a different percentage just about for every quarter depending on the grade every time you do the test. But what we know is that proficient readers read with about 97% accuracy. And this has been confirmed again and again and again, which is why when we're looking at sorting students into different categories and trying to design instruction for them, we want to keep that number in mind. So here's the chart that Lexi shared with us, and I've color-coded it for you to see it here. We have, in the top left, the high accuracy, high rate. So I've given all my assessments, and the best time to really do this is right after a benchmarking period, fall, winter, or spring. But you can really pull this sheet out and sort of use it as a thinking tool at any time in the year to really kind of reframe what your goals should be with specific students. So high accuracy, high rate, they've read above 97% accuracy and they've met the benchmark goal, and hopefully they've well exceeded it, because if they're just at the line, just crossed over into that green zone, it's probably not high enough, and you might want to look at them a little closer too. So high accuracy, high rate, these kids probably have great reading comprehension already. There's probably not a lot that you need to change for them. The box below it, high accuracy, low rate, this is that group that you might need to tease out a little further. Are some of these students just slow readers who take their time but really understand everything they're doing and their writing looks strong. Probably nothing needs to change except for maybe some more chances for repeated reading or some of the things Tim Rosinski likes to do with readers theater. Those are good activities for students in this range, high accuracy, low rate. Some of these students, however, not only do they have a low reading rate, but they also do weird things with their phrasing. So, they don't sound like they know what they're reading, which again speaks to another kind of reading intervention. May or may not need to be done by someone else. A reading specialist or reading teacher could just be done by a classroom teacher. Those are decisions to make together as a team when you're thinking about how kids are doing. And that's where your progress monitoring data is really going to inform. You think, okay, we're going to put this group of students in a readers theater intervention along with their core and give them a lot of feedback on their prosody. Perhaps then we should be able to see if what we're doing is working. The progress monitoring data will show that. Okay, then we have the two pink boxes, low accuracy and high rate, low accuracy and low rate. The low accuracy, high rate is probably one of the toughest groups to remediate because they think they're good readers. And they make a lot of mistakes. They're reading fast. Somewhere along the line, they learned that reading is about reading really quickly, and that's not a good thing. Reading is to be conversational, to be thinking about what you're reading. And so the question you'll need to ask is, if I slow this student down, do they make less mistakes? And if by just coaching on slowing them down and their accuracy goes up to at or above 97, they're probably okay. Oftentimes, what we've seen in our district is we slow these kids down and it reveals that they really do have a decoding issue. They frequently show up in late second, early third grade if we haven't caught them before that. And so that requires more intensive phonics instruction to be given to them and to prompt them to slow down. So we'll talk more about that shortly. And finally, the low accuracy, low rate. Well, those are your red zone kids that really do need extensive, systematic, explicit phonics, lots of carefully chosen text to support their reading because their foundational skills are not established. Lexi suggests for kids in second through fifth grade, if you are seeing students in this range in the pink, whether they're low accuracy, high rate, or low accuracy, low rate, doesn't matter which, their accuracy is in question, to give them a diagnostic test on phonics. And this is one she shared with us called the Quick Phonics Diagnostic, and I will make it available to Laura. It's nothing magical. There's others out there, but we found it to be helpful. And you just give it to the point of frustration. Well, before that, you want to stop before the student gets frustrated. And there's teacher directions that go along with it, but you can clearly see just by glancing at it that it starts at the sound level, moving up through CVC, and you're getting, the final E rule, the R control vowels, and so forth. And you can sort of pinpoint where is it on the phonics continuum that the student's beginning to struggle, and I should start my instruction maybe one step back from there to secure those skills and move forward. So the retail fluency is another measure that's offered by DIBELS Next, and I've just included this one snapshot from their training manual, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you that are using it, but basically what you're doing is counting the number of words the student retells, and every word that isn't, not a word like the and the gets counted as long as it's related to the story. And then you're also listening for a qualitative response to how many details did the student provide, and they give you a nice rubric. And this all gets factored into that composite score. Interesting to note that the research on the retell, I've heard two things. And if you look at the data, it'll say that you improve that predictive ability by doing the retell, but you improve it only by a few percentage points. So if you're feeling like it's taking you really a super long time, and it does, it takes 5 or 6 extra minutes to do a retell per student, minimal, you are ending up adding a lot of time to your screening. So I would recommend weighing out your cost benefit on that and just thinking through who should we give this to? Does every student need to do it? And certainly there's absolute value in getting this content and this information, but do you get it in other ways as well? And again, I say, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. I think you'll just know that the research says it only gives you a few extra percentage points up by doing the retail. So cost-benefit analysis there. Okay. Comprehension strategies, the DAYS isn't going to give you an insight on the student's comprehension strategy, nor is the maze from Ames Web. But when we think about DIBELS and early literacy skills, it's important for us to recognize that these foundational skills really are incredibly important in terms of building students' strengths and really helping them move forward. They can't become strong readers without their ability to decode the word. Okay, so tips. For those students who are in that yellow box, or for students who are in that, their accuracy is more in that strategic range, the research suggests that you ask the students to sound out the word first and look for the parts they know, and then have them sound it out and read for content again, start the sentence over. So the child would say thrug for the word through, and the teacher is going to prompt O-U-G-H, and this word says ooh, try again. And then the student would sound out through, say it fast, okay, through, now start the whole sentence again. She went through the door. So getting the students to keep their eyes in the word is tremendously powerful. For those really at-risk students, those really red zone students who just do not have their alphabetic principle cracked, one of the things we've learned in our district is to really attend to the is to help them relieve their anxiety. And instead of watching them kind of struggle with they're not really sure what to do, we prompt them to sound out the word. We just tell them that word is because, what word, okay? Now because we'd have to spell it, looking at every letter. Some of the words like, from or she, we're going to sound out those words and then start the sentence again. And if you can find a cognitive routine that keeps the student in the word first, and you always say the same thing when you're addressing that word, what happens is the students stop worrying about what you're going to say, and they start thinking about what they need to do and learn. Because they're already coming to the table with a lot of anxiety. They already don't want to stay in the word because they're stressed out about it. And so by providing a prompt like that word is from, what word, sound it out or spell it, say it again, and then start the sentence over, you're helping to lay those neural pathways and reorganize that structure in their brain that's mapped that word incorrectly in the first place. So, and eye movement research really has shown us that kids do look at every single letter of every word, so we do want to be encouraging them first to say the sounds in the word. Now, I realize that what I just said is not what probably many of you are doing, because the practice typically has been to use the cueing strategies. Think about what makes sense, check the picture, does this make sense, look at the parts of the word, and finally at the very end we would ask them to sound it out. And what the research from Shaywitz and Motes and Archer and many others have confirmed since the National Reading Panel, that this strategy actually is more challenging for the at-risk reader than it is for than we might believe it to be. So even though lots of children can navigate this and do very, very well, what bears out is that the youngest and most fragile students are stuck. So if you have a third grader who's still in that red zone, and this is the cueing strategy you've been using, I would ask you to reflect on that and say, the research suggests that flipping it upside down and having them sound it out, look for the parts, and then confirm with context, that is going to give you more bang for your buck. And if you do it the same way every time, the students are less anxious about word solving, and you'll find that it really does work very, very well. And so what about heart words? Well, it can work with high-frequency words as well. You simply have to point out, like in the word said, that the AI in the word said doesn't say what it usually would say, which is A, and this sort of says A, and that's where you would draw a heart above that, and that's the part the students would have to memorize, that the AI says something else. But the S is going to say what it always says, and the D is going to say what it frequently says. So there is power in that strategy of sounding out, and there's high utility in it, and the research definitely supports using that with our most at-risk students. Okay, so coming back to that rope, the green box has been very heavily researched, and what I shared you can find in great detail in Mosa's book, Speech to Print. Okay, so what happens for kids when we're looking at the progress monitoring data and we see that they are really not accurate? If we go back to that slide that shows a graph, I'm just going to slide back there. Sorry, I know that's really distracting, and I do it. There it is. There's a slide of the student who started off the year. This is a high rate, low accuracy student. High rate, low accuracy. So that's why they're being progress monitored. And yes, you see all these greens, and here's a yellow because the teacher is pushing them to be thinking about accuracy. And then middle of the year, the intensity of the intervention changed. And we really began to encourage the students to think carefully about how they word solved and prompted them. And you can see on the bottom in the lower graph, the percentage of words read accurately. This is a third grader from last year. They're now in fourth grade, and I just checked their Ames web data, and this student is reading with 100% accuracy now. And their rate of reading is still in that strategic zone, but it's just under the benchmark. So the work that was done in third grade continues to pay off in fourth. So now I'm going to skip back. Forgive the skipping. Okay, so the data trends. As the percentage of words read accurately increases, the student's rate, as you saw in that on that graph, often decreases because you're really getting them to think before they speak. So you want to be sure when you're calculating your data that you are always calculating the accuracy and the words read per minute. Because remember, proficient readers read with 97% accuracy, and that's been verified consistently. Dick Allington, there's a lot of research to confirm this. So we want that bar for our struggling readers to be there so they know what the goal is. Teach with the end in mind, right? So tips for rate. Provide ample opportunity for the students to first read with accuracy and then read again with accuracy. And then on those third and fourth readings, fluency and prosody are what you're working on. Okay, and so there's that student one more time. You can see, even though it's still showing red here, so the caution would be, if we were just looking at this graph and we didn't know anything about the intervention, probably you're saying, why didn't they take this student out of the intervention? Because we had in-program data about the child, and we had this accuracy information at the bottom that said that what we're doing, despite these red dots, is actually working. And so that student continued in their intervention, even though the red dots are here. You can see that they're hovering right at the line, and it's kind of a mystery to me why they weren't green, but they weren't. So the student is doing well this year. Okay, so self-monitoring. Just briefly touch on that. Of course, it does matter, and for those students who are wildly inaccurate and fast readers, you want to slow them down and get them to pay attention to what they're doing right before they want to say that word. Are they just guessing off the first sound? Are they substituting? And a phrase that I like to use with students and that I've shared with my teachers is honor the words the author wrote. The author picked those words for a reason, so you don't get to change them. And think before you speak. So slow them down, get them to really attend to what they need to read. So highly inaccurate readers read with less than 97, they're reading with less than 97% accuracy. Their reading rates can sometimes be very slow, or they can be super, super fast, depending on the nature of the reader. So accuracy, when it comes to progress monitoring and self-monitoring, that's going to trump your rate, especially if that's the bigger concern. Many of the tips that I've mentioned are in this book, Next Steps in Literacy Instruction by Susan Smart and Deborah Glasser. It's aligned with DIBELS Next, Ames Web. It's an excellent teacher-friendly resource. I highly recommend it. And it will give you specific tips to use throughout your instruction, whichever area you're focusing on. These are other resources that we found useful in my district, the Florida Center for Reading Research, Reading Rockets, and the Colorado Department of Education actually has a very good reading site. If you're interested in investigating further, they link quite a few helpful resources there too. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you gained some valuable insights on the whole DIBELS connecting to classroom instruction. It's very important to be sure we are connecting all the dots for our students and paying attention to our instruction, as I know you are. And I thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to email or contact me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to follow up. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy, so much for sharing your expertise and for helping us to really see how DIBELS Next fits into balanced early literacy assessment.
You're welcome.